Hello. Oh, this is just the microphone for that, right? Yeah. It's not actually projecting. That's right. You'll do great. You did great. So I just figured out what I'm going to read as we are walking from dinner to here. So I'm going to read two things. I'm going to read a poem, and then I'm going to read part of an essay that I've been working on since 1998. So we were also talking at dinner, as well as in general, about things that take a while to come to fruition. I'm going to read these two pieces because the poem includes pieces of a story that I then rewrote in this essay, or this part of this essay that I'm going to read. So I thought, because I frequently do that, where I try out different content in different forms. Sometimes, more often than not, I try it out first in poetry, and just to kind of get like the general matter, and then I go as far with that as I can go, and I rewrite it in prose because I actually want to get to fill in the negative space. So that's what I'm going to do. The poem is, my daughter was born in August of 2018, and at least for the first year of her life, it was extremely difficult to write. It's still extremely difficult to write. The only time I could really write in any sustained way was between midnight and 4 in the morning, she was actually awake. She'd often wake up to feed, so we'd all wake up together, and we'd all be in bed together, and I had these tiny little notebooks, and I would just write as she was feeding, and then the second she went to sleep, I would stop writing. So I ended up writing this long poem. I've never read any of this, certainly not out loud, but I haven't even really read this all in my head. I just transcribed it from the notebooks into the computer. So bear with me as I work through the nerves of reading this poem, and then I'll read the essay. So I want to start by giving this epigraph, which is a mashup of a line from Alejandro and a line from Allison. Beneath the mask of a father is a grapefruit, a monster throwing questions without answers. The poem is called You're going to steal that from yourself? It's good to steal from yourself, actually. The poem is called The Hour of the Rat. I'll say that for 1 month in 2010, my partner Lisa and I lived on a farm in Boonville, Missouri, which is rural Missouri. Her name is Lisa, our daughter's name is Yumi. The Hour of the Rat. A persimmon fell from the sky, landed in the old world, nails beneath the skeleton, asleep in its chalk. A greater gravity divulging. The sky must have shaken, the trees tall and straight. Did we see any branches, or when the trees ended? Long necks of petrified grass, and woods that rose out of a pond. The persimmon was a thought, produced by undeclared meditation. It resembled the peach inside the boy inside the peach, the true ancestor in story and land, the child incipient in a quiet confirmed by generations of being dwelled upon, land where grandmother opened her eyes and years later began to remember. The persimmon, entranced in the first feet of woods, stole memories from the pond, rolled its nose in the memories. One morning we saw a family of turkeys at the edge of a field, turned towards the levee overlooking the pond. We walked around looking for suds, found an ornament hanging. Was there a picture of our daughter in the field guide? Where did the persimmon begin? In the quicksand, in the creek that cut through the corn. Lasso of mosquitoes in the park above the bottoms. The echo of the public pool, the tea shop, in the back of the antique store, as a portrait in the fins of the tree. A root must have reached the head of a flame in the gestational world and turned overnight to ice, sending shock waves up through the earth to the sleeping daughter. There was one Asian man in town. He told a story about standing beneath a blue light bulb outside a jazz club in rural Missouri and looking at his blue skin, thinking, I look like everyone else beneath the light. He cried. He shed being Japanese emotionally. I skipped a page. He shed being Japanese by being blue. His mother must have felt the ancestors pardon her son's momentary wish to be extinct. I met him in the parking lot of the store where I bought boots and a machete. His name was Paul. In what ways does our daughter look Japanese beneath blue light bulbs? Water dripping in a cave, a paste put on one's face to hasten one's passage into ghosthood. It is attraction, not subtle, attacks on strangers that one loves at night, the sound of 11 weeks, or is it 12? The hours are still ticking, the fourth trimester. My dreams these days take place inside the sound of Yumi struggling to identify physically, emotionally, outside Lisa's womb. I have a dog. The dog is not mine. I have, like having sex. I'm having dog. We're in the woods, walking on a path. The path inclines. The woods tilt, become triangle. The dog is a train, pulling me to the top of the woods, pyramid. We lived on that lake. People were in the midst of babies. Innumerable people, not many. We knew. We were focused on solitude, kept inviting friends over, dogs. Did she exist then? There was a fake fireplace and a bag of carrots. The lake turned to ice, was one phase of night. The more electric phase was the ice turning back, quasars bounding the edges of a bowl, people in their night attitudes unfreezing too, the sound of an unconsummated ricochet. On the bowl are painted scenes of life in the mountains, strokes of people, small waves and trees. I've wandered around these halls before, only they've become more ornate. I'm in the lobby of a hotel. The lobby is crowded. The crowd is constantly moving, everyone in every direction. I hear my name. I look up and see my father coming down the escalator. His hair pulled up in a large bun, like a pom-pom or a second featureless head. He's carrying 3 young children. They're swaddled, but not exactly babies. He introduces them. I'm surprised they're white. They don't speak or make noise. I don't tell them about Yumi. I haven't told them about Yumi. Their children are emerging from their swaddles. They have fig faces. 2 have blonde hair. 3 faces at the bottom of an escalator wrapped in white lettuce. 3 children, the acid pretension. And my father, like a piper or a thief, hauling home his bouquet of orphans. Yumi is 12 weeks old. The persimmon fell far from its tree, blew through the deluge that bound it to the score of its drama. A more perfect life in the leaves is more placid. Are you ready to go back? The woods were as deep as the state of Missouri, but thin, reliquaries of all the lost prisms out of which all the rainbows had been discharged, cruising low to the ground. The persimmon was loosed from a starship. The trees were dry coughs. Only one tree was needed. Which was it? Lisa shook them. They were slender and tall, reticent beanstalks. Life goes on. Life goes under. The sky becomes water. The water becomes cloud. Rolled up, chaotic, impermeable yet impressionable. Ride of the devils. Yumi was a teenager. We got home from traveling. I stepped out. When I came back, home was replaced by unfamiliar woods. 2 snakes were stretched where home used to be. I ran. I must have it wrong, I thought, running. The persimmon is a grandmother in the body of a child, ancient, ageless, made of sun and sea. the parting of the continents to rest a single cell of life not yet manifested. Deference is to hang a portrait of the persimmon high on the wall, angled slightly down so it can watch the comings and goings. Humans scream out at 3:10 in the morning, having shifted in their cribs, having rotated and drifted a foot away from where they were put down. I want to die and for my daughter to replace me, and for my daughter to gather together everything I made, including everything I thought and believed or was about to, and erase it and replace it with what she's made, is making, thinks, believes, or is about to. My daughter cries until the sun dies. That is when her tail grows. Her Mongolian spot has gotten larger, is overtaking her left butt cheek. I forget to greet it. It is superior divination and secrecy, the Apollonian vector. Whiter babies stalk and slaughter their dreams, if they are not suffocated in the webs. She runs through door after door, becomes a silhouette. The doors are magenta, late afternoon. We pass each hour in grass and watch the laureled skeletons walk past. Why isn't every day of the dead? Why doesn't dead end in S? Why have the police been permitted to infiltrate memorials and protests with their perversions? My daughter can smell them. Their oil is metal, their blood is sponge, and fast-drying whiteout. I was on a bus. The bus was entering a city in winter, Midwestern. People I half knew, everyone facing forward, cold as snow. The road was a slope. I was getting off. I was going to walk. I was walking. More European than Midwestern, more New York than Boston. I had a plane ticket. It said Paris via Scandinavia. I did not want to go. Uni was having trouble breathing, was snorting the sky, and was hungry. I flushed myself into a room to pack my bags, said goodbye to her dolls. Maybe it would be like the desert when it floods, when the rivers run. Stone buildings on the banks with balconies, where one can absorb the waves, after the river passes, one final expulsion signals a return to drought, like a final perforation or death rattle. Then the buildings evaporate, and the weeds resume haywire. I did not want to go anywhere. I had to be mature in a nondescript city, and place her dolls lovingly on a small shelf in a closet. I wondered, does she know the door is there? Does she know what's behind it? So that's the poem, and this is the prose. I met a Japanese-American man in Boonville, Missouri. I saw him first in Snoddy's, the general store in neighboring Franklin, where Lisa and I bought our food and machetes and rubber boots and where we went to the bathroom. I saw him again in the parking lot, getting into his car. I became one of those people who live in and fortify majority white towns who gawk at Asians, including Asians who live in those towns. Watching the man get into his car, I became one of those people, and with all the thoughts I imagine they have. Where did he come from? What is he doing here? As the man was getting into his car, he looked at me. I felt his eyes on me, and with them a rush of dopamine, but it was brief. Then he was in his car, backing out of the parking lot and on the road. It did not occur to me then, in the moment when he looked at me, that he, the Japanese-American man, had become one of those people who live in and fortify majority white towns, who gawk at Asians, and that he was thinking what I was thinking, but about me. Where did he come from? What is he doing here? Where did I come from? What was I doing there? Lisa and I lived for 1 month on a farm up the hill from the Missouri River. Lisa's family farm, 300 acres, where her mother and aunt and uncles grew up, where her grandparents had a house and a barn, long since knocked down, horses, long since buried, and a vegetable garden, long since plowed under. Everyone had moved away decades ago, her grandparents into town, her aunt and uncles to Kansas, her mother to St. Louis. The farm was no longer a farm but land, divided by wild and thick woods into fields, each field wild and thick with grass that grew over our heads. One morning we discovered in the woods among the leaves a persimmon, orange with a film of dust, yet shining. Neither of us had seen a persimmon in the wild. It looked by itself out of place and sentient, as fruits sometimes do when they look out of place. We looked up, but did not see persimmons in any of the trees, all of which were different, sizes, colors. From which tree had the persimmon fallen? We shook the trees to give up their fruits, but nothing fell. We went to the library. Lisa found a field guide to trees. We found the persimmon. We memorized its bark. We recited its pattern over and over on the drive back to the farm and back into the woods. And there it was, the bark. But the tree was thin and tall, unlike the photograph in the field guide. We shook the tree. Nothing happened. Its branches were high in the air. We kept shaking it until a single persimmon, like the final fragment of a meteor that has long since burned out, fell and landed unceremoniously at our feet. Formerly in remote places, the old woman who had no children was taunted by the epithet old persimmon leaf. In the spring of 1945, with bombs falling on Japan, the folklorist Kunio Yanagita wrote a book called About Our Ancestors, in which he articulates the system by which the souls of the dead, which were in the spring of 1945 very rapidly being released, would be remembered. In it, he writes about how homeless spirits were once referred to as persimmon leaves. Relatives who died young, were unmarried, estranged, or had no living relations were treated differently and separately from the rest of the ancestors. Their offerings, rice for example, were placed on a lower level of the altar, and not on a dish, but on a persimmon leaf, which were later, unlike the dishes, thrown out. A few weeks after seeing the Japanese-American man in the parking lot, I met him. We were visiting a friend of Lisa's aunt in a house on a hill above the river. Lisa's aunt was in her 70s, lived in Kansas, and was visiting. Some of her friends still lived in Boonville, had never left. Her friend invited a few people over. We tagged along, including Lisa's aunt's best friend from high school, who arrived with her husband, who just so happened to be the Japanese-American man. "I think I've seen you before," he said, coming up to me. "I think I've seen you before too," I said back. Then, in confirmation of the conversation I was having in my mind in the parking lot, he asked, "What are you doing here?" I told him that Lisa and I were living, camping on her family's land. He seemed amused and bemused, maybe also a little suspect. He asked me my name. "Shimoda," I said. When I asked him his name, he said, "Paul." We stood in the living room. We never sat down. Paul had been in Boonville a long time, since his 20s. He was in his 70s now. He did not say, because I hesitated to ask, how he got there. The assumption about a Japanese-American man in the middle of Missouri is that he was not from there, but got there, as if he fell out of the sky or washed up on the shore of the river. An assumption I did not want and did not need to share with him. Ooh.
This happened earlier.
I can still see. Should I just...
Keep going.
He told the story to everyone. And even though it seemed he told the story for my benefit and his own, he made eye contact when he told it with everyone else but me. Here's his story. When Paul was in his 20s, he went with his girlfriend, now his wife, standing there in the room, and a group of their friends, including some of the other people standing there in the room, to a jazz club a few towns away. The jazz club was where musicians played between Kansas City or Sedalia and Columbia or St. Louis. Hanging above the front door to the club, above the sidewalk, was a single light bulb, naked and blue. Everyone who entered or exited the club had to pass beneath and become momentarily the blue light. The story Paul told is that he and his friends were standing on the sidewalk outside the club, either coming or going, and talking, when he noticed that he was standing directly underneath the blue light. He held out his arms, his hands. His skin was blue. He touched his face as if he could see with his blue hands his blue face. And he said that he felt, for a moment, not Japanese, as if bathing in it, the blue light rinsed off his Asianness. He said he felt he looked in that blue light like everyone else, by which he meant like his white friends, by which he meant white, even though his skin was not white, but blue, and it was not even blue, and his white friends were not standing underneath the blue light with him. That was the beginning and the end of his story. It was clear that Paul's moment beneath the blue light had an enormous and over time ultimately mournful impact on his life in Boonville, Missouri. Mournful because the blue light was hanging half a century ago and had presumably long since burned out. I can hear the light bulb shattering above the sidewalk, shards of glass thrown into the street. Yet it became talismanic in his memory. The blue light became where he could go, where he could place himself in his mind to imagine not being who and what he was, which made the blue light seem an awful lot like a majority white town in Missouri. Paul's white friends, including his wife, listened to Paul's story and laughed. Paul laughed too, so did I, which made me sad, although I did not and do not know which made me sadder. The idea that Paul was not and could never be one of them, one of the white people by which he surrounded himself, or the idea that because he had surrounded himself his whole life with white people, he was one of them. Paul's white friends had not, half a century before, shared that moment with him. Even though he felt bathed in that blue light, momentarily transformed and invisible, at least blended in, that was not the experience of anyone else who saw their friend Paul standing beneath that blue light, holding out his blue arms and hands, bringing them up to his blue face. Thank you.